Welcome to Tense Aspect Case, Untangling the Knots. This is designed to be a gentle introduction that explains two of the most notorious ideas in language, which pretty much anyone who encounters them thinks, what is this, myself included, and can really be a stumbling block. But once you get them, and hopefully I'll be able to break them down to make them super understandable today, once you get these ideas, you'll think, how did I ever not understand it? They eventually become really simple and straightforward. Hopefully that's what I can do today. But of course, if there's anything that I've explained here that isn't clear, or I've just frankly completely messed up and got something wrong, please leave a comment underneath or get in touch with me, and I'll be more than happy to respond and go into things any further or clarify things that I've messed up. So let's get started. Let's start first with tense and aspect. And after this, we'll do the cases, really specifically ergativity. So let's, for the time being, we'll look at part one, tense and aspect. So one of the most important things to remember here is that tense and aspect are properties of language. Tense and aspect only exist in language. Time is a thing that we experience, and you could have no language whatsoever if you lived out in the middle of nowhere and had no contact with people, never acquired language, you would still have a concept of the passage of time. But tense and aspect are things that only exist in language. They are actually a phenomenon in language. That's a really important thing to remember. So the two key questions, if we're ever looking at a verb or a part of a sentence and trying to think, is there aspect here or is there tense here? The questions we can ask are, when does something happen relative to now? Are we being told when something happens? That's the first question. The second question is, what flow of time does this thing happen in? So let's get into that a little bit more. When we're looking purely at tense, that's something that English speakers are really, really familiar with. We have a really good concept of tense. When does something happen relative to now? And we can tell right away that if I said I ate, it's in the past because it happened before now. If I said I am eating, that's absolutely in the present, so it's the same time as now. And I will eat, it hasn't happened yet, so it's going to happen after now. And that's tense there, that's pure tense. If we look at these three things here, I ate, I am eating, I will eat, we can tell when they are happening. It actually tells us. And now is basically at the time that you're creating the sentence. So that's pretty straightforward, and I think everyone's going to get that with no problem. Aspect, however, is something that we don't really talk about at school, at least when I went to school. We don't really discuss it or have a concept of it, broadly speaking, in general society, like we do tense. But English has aspect as well. So when we're looking at aspect, we're asking the question, what flow of time does something happen in? And look at these two examples here. I ate dinner and I was eating dinner. Now, at face value, we can see that there's some different constructions there. They are different phrases, but in some ways we could say they're sort of describing the same thing. The act of eating dinner that happened in the past. There's the tense part of it. However, aspect is different here between these two. If we look at I ate dinner, that suggests that you were eating and then you stopped, probably because you finished. Whereas I was eating dinner looks like you were in the middle of it. There's no real assumption that you definitely finished. So we can try this by adding little bits to these phrases. And the one I'm going to try is adding, and I am still eating now. So now we're talking about the present. But the I ate dinner and the I was eating dinner is in the past. So if I said, I was eating dinner and I am still eating now, that makes sense. That sounds quite natural. I was eating dinner earlier and I'm still eating now. I've been eating for quite a while. And that's because I was eating dinner is more of a progressive, non-complete act. I was eating dinner doesn't necessarily say that you stopped. However, I ate dinner makes it clear that you are not doing it anymore because you finished the job. So if we said, I ate dinner and I am still eating now, that sounds a bit weird. I ate dinner and I'm still eating now. Well, did you eat it or not? I was eating dinner and I'm still eating it now. Yeah, I've been eating it for quite a long time. This is a key difference between probably the two most core and common distinctions in aspect. The perfective, where something has a definite end, and imperfective, where it doesn't really have a definite end. It seems somewhat ongoing. In the perfective, we have the idea of an end point. Imperfective, it's ongoing and flowing. And if we look at another example where we add something to the context, if I said, when the phone rang, I ate dinner, and I also said, when the phone rang, I was eating dinner, even though this all happened in the past, they're two different sentences. When the phone rang, I ate dinner strongly suggests that the phone rang and then you started eating dinner. So it has a definite beginning. However, when the phone rang, I was eating dinner, in this sentence, you were already eating dinner, then the phone rang. So it doesn't have a distinct beginning. And it may not have a distinct ending, because maybe you picked up the phone or you just ignored it and you kept eating. There's no suggestion of a specific ending or beginning, whereas when the phone rang, I ate dinner sounds like the phone rang, then you ate. Maybe you were waiting for someone to say it's time to eat, or maybe someone said they'd call you at dinner time, and you said, well, I'm not going to pick up, but it will tell me when to do it. Whatever the context is, it doesn't matter. But we can see that these two examples, they all happened in the past, but the aspect is different. If it has a specific beginning or end, it's going to be different to something that is freely flowing with no clear beginning or end. So we would look at these, and let's call these imperfect and perfect. Perfect, we think it's perfect because it's got a finishing point. Imperfect because it doesn't have a finished point, or a beginning point. It can be as well. But importantly, aspect is not tense. If we have the sentences I was eating and I ate, they are both in the past tense, but one is imperfective and one is perfective. Similarly, I am eating and I eat are both in the present, but they are different in their aspect, and I will be eating and I will eat are both in the future, but have different aspect. So you can separate these, and a verb form like eating doesn't actually tell us anything about tense, because we can then change the verb before it, the to be or copula. I was eating, I am eating, I will be eating. Eating itself doesn't say anything about when it happens. It simply talks about the flow of the act of eating. Whereas ate, eat, and will eat have explicit tense. So it's important to recognize that tense and aspect are different. And in fact, some languages will only employ one of these things, whereas English combines them in a lot of different ways. There are languages in Asia and various parts of the world that have no explicit tense, purely aspect. And there are other languages where they really strongly have tense, but very little in terms of aspect. In English, of course, we have a combination, and in a lot of languages of Australia, we have combinations as well. So in English, as a bit of a rundown, if we're looking at tense, we're going to have things like verb ed, like walked, which is the perfective, but we'll also have was walking, etc. And that indicates that it was in the past. Then we've got walk, walks, is walking, and will walk, will be walking, etc. This is all tense information. Aspect, however, we'll have things like have verb ed, like had walked. There we're saying it definitely stopped. It definitely finished. Whereas aspect in English, we can also have things like that ing form, but we don't use the ing form on its own. We always have that helper verb that comes before it. Am, is, will be, etc. So if you just said, you can't say I walking. You need that helper verb there, and it's on that helper verb that we actually get the tense information. I was walking, I am walking, I will be walking. In all of these, walking doesn't tell us tense at all. It simply tells us the aspect that it's ongoing. And it's on the was, am, will be that we get the tense information. So in this situation, we get one verb that tells us tense and another that tells us aspect. Similarly, I had walked, past, I have walked, present, and I will have walked, future. In all of these, walked is perfective, has a distinct end point. But the tense information is on had, have, will have. So we can separate these here. But in many languages, it's not a simple separation because you will have things like a suffix which has the meaning of past continuous, which in some ways simplifies it because you don't have to calculate several verbs at once. There's a single verb with a single suffix. Let's have a look at a bit of a tool that you can use to identify whether tense or aspect is involved as a real rule of thumb. So if we look at a verb, does the verb tell us when the event happens in relation to now? And it's important to remember that little time descriptors like now, yesterday, tomorrow, later, they're not explicitly marked for tense. Tense and or aspect are generally the properties of verbs, which is how languages like Mandarin Chinese can have no tense, but you think, well, how do they talk about things that happen before, now, or later? They will use descriptors like now with a verb which has no tense. So that's why they are tenseless, because the verb has no tense. It doesn't mean they can't talk about the past or the future. It means that the verbs have no tense because tense is a property of language. It's not a real thing. So back to the question, does the verb tell us when the event happens in relation to now? So if the verb doesn't tell us, for example, walking doesn't tell us when this thing happened. So we can tell that there is no tense on walking. If the answer is yes, does the verb tell us when the event happens in relation to now? We have tense. So on walking, there's no tense information, but on walked, there is past tense information. So that tells us that walked is marked for tense and walking is marked for aspect, or at least lacks tense. In a similar way, if we flip it round, does the verb tell us about the flow of time it occurs in? If the answer is no, then there is no aspect involved. But if the answer is yes, then we have aspect. So in summary, tense and aspect are all about how verbs are marked. They're not about these additional parts of the sentence. We're really only looking at verbs, and verbs are a thing in language. They don't exist in the real world. Tense tells us when an event occurs, and aspect tells us over what flow of time an action occurs. Languages can be purely aspectual, can be purely temporal, i.e. tense-based, or a combination of both. So hopefully I've shed some light on aspect there. We'll now go to part 2, which is on case, and this is the other dagger for so many people who are trying to wrap their heads around various aspects of language. English has a fairly specific relationship with case, which we'll go into a little bit, but hopefully this will shed some light on what specifically ergativity is. So just like with aspect, we can say that nouns and cases are properties of language, whereas people and things exist in the world. Likewise, if you grew up on your own, completely isolated from anyone and never acquired language, you would certainly be aware that there are things around you, but you wouldn't have a concept of nouns at all because they are a thing that exists in language. It's really important to remember these things because sometimes when we're trying to understand various parts of language, we start to think about what they're referring to rather than that we're actually talking about language itself. So again, we can ask some questions when we look at something if we're trying to work out case. Who or what is doing something? Who is the agent? Who is the actor? Who is the one who's actually performing the action? Or who is experiencing the action? It's not always the person doing it. It can be the topic, the person or thing that is experiencing something. But we'll go into this a little bit later. And the second question is, are they doing it to someone or something? Is there another person or thing involved? Or it may even be themselves who is receiving that action. So they're the two most important questions we can ask at the beginning. So let's look at an example. In these English sentences, how do we know what role this cute little critter is performing? Or what role are they taking in the sentence? A penguin swims. A penguin catches a fish. A fish sees a penguin. There is water on a penguin. A fish swims toward a penguin. A present for a penguin. A fish swims away from a penguin. And a penguin's feathers are wet. If you have a look at these are all quite straightforward sentences. But we can see that different things are happening involving the penguin in all of these sentences. And the question is, how do we know as English speakers? It's very natural to us that we know what's going on. We can picture these right away. But how do we know what is doing what and if it's to something or not at all? So let's look at these a bit closer. And we can see that in the very first two, a penguin swims and a penguin catches a fish, in both of these cases, the penguin is actively doing something. Whereas in the third example, a fish sees a penguin, we can see that it's not the penguin who is doing something, it's a fish. But the penguin is the recipient of that action. It's having something done to them. The next four examples, we can see that there is water on a penguin, a fish swims toward a penguin, a present for a penguin, a fish swims away from a penguin. In each of these, the penguin isn't really doing anything in particular, but the action is occurring in relation to them. It might be specifying location, or it might be a more abstract thing like for someone. And that's another category. There we can see that these all have, in green, these prepositions on, toward, for, and away from. And finally, a penguin's feathers are wet. Here, the penguin isn't quite doing anything, and the topic of this sentence is not quite the penguin anymore. It's actually more about the feathers. And that apostrophe S that we write there indicates that the feathers belong to the penguin. And we can also see that in these sentences, they are grouped roughly by the sequence, the order of the sentence. In the first two, we can see that a penguin is the one doing something because a penguin comes first, before the verb, and also before a fish. In the third example, however, we see a fish comes first, then the verb, then a penguin. And that to us is indicating who is doing what. If I said a penguin catches a fish and I said a fish catches a penguin, they are two different scenarios. But we can also see, importantly, that in all of these, a penguin is the same phrase over and over and over again. A penguin never changes in these examples. The only thing that changes about it is where it sits in the sentence. And this indicates that a noun phrase, or a noun in general in English, doesn't use case. It uses only its position in the sentence to tell us who is doing what to something else, or if they're doing something that isn't affecting someone else. So these first three examples are what we're going to focus on, because these are what we would call the core cases, or these core arrangements. And the remaining cases, or the remaining arrangements, are things that are certainly very interesting and especially important in a lot of languages of Australia, but they are we're not going to get into these in much depth today. That's for another time. So we're really going to focus on these first three, where we have something or someone doing something, and whether or not something else is receiving that action in some way. So let's look at this in a different way. And now, instead of saying a penguin, we're going to say that Clarence is the name of this penguin and that Clarence is male. And I would have liked to have made this penguin female, but you'll see that he sort of has to be male for this example to work, and I'll explain that in a moment. So if we, instead of saying a penguin, because we've met Clarence and we like Clarence and we consider him a friend now, we're not going to say a penguin every time. That's very formal and a bit rude. We're just going to refer to Clarence as he, etc. In these examples, the exact same situations are occurring, but we're replacing a penguin with his pronouns. So now we have he swims, he catches a fish sees him, there is water on him, a present for him, a fish swims away from him, a fish swims toward him, and his feathers are wet. Now, we can tell right away here that the sequence of words, the actual order of the words, hasn't changed at all. But, importantly, the pronoun has changed. We can group these. With the first two, we have he. The next five, we have him. And the last one, we have his. And although I would have liked to have made this penguin female, if we had done that, it would be she, her, and her. So with male pronouns, we have that three-part distinction that just makes things a bit clearer. But I think Clarence is a good name for a penguin in any case. So here we've got he swims and he catches a fish. He makes it very clear that they are the subject of the sentence. They're the one performing it in most cases. A fish sees him. We can tell right away that the penguin, Clarence, is not doing the seeing. If we changed him to he, a fish sees he, it wouldn't be grammatical in English, but we would be keeping the same word order. Likewise, if we said him sees a fish, that also isn't grammatical in English, but we would probably understand that Clarence is seeing the fish. So in English, we keep these word orders, but we've also got cases on our pronouns only. It's the only time we use cases in English is on pronouns. It's the difference between she, her. It's the difference between they and them. And of course, he, him, and his. And then of course there's I, me, my, and you, your. So these examples make it quite clear that in English, on our pronouns only, we can change the shape of the pronoun to indicate even more clearly what role they are taking. The sentence structure remains the same, but we've decided that we want to make it super, super clear who is doing what. So whenever we see he, we know that that person or penguin is doing something or is the topic, the subject of this sentence. Whenever we see him, we know that they are receiving something. There's water on him. They're not really doing anything, but they are experiencing something or receiving something. A fish sees him. They're not quite doing anything. They could do whatever they like, swimming around, things that penguins like to do, but it's the fish who's actually performing the activity. And in the final one, his feathers are wet. We're indicating a relationship of ownership or possession. But the feathers themselves are actually the thing we're talking about. So this is case in English, which only exists on our pronouns. Imagine now this concept where we have a specific way of talking about something when it's doing something, and then another way when it's at the other end of that activity, and another one that shows ownership. That is what case is. And many languages around the world, and a lot of languages in Australia, have case on all nouns, not just pronouns. The other big piece of the puzzle that you need to wrap your head around to really understand cases in First Nations languages in Australia is transitive and intransitive. We can separate verbs into different categories. So we can call transitive verbs verbs that have an object. They have that recipient. It takes two to tango with a transitive verb. So, for example, get, want, and find. We can try these in English and look at, for example, get. We can think, what's a good example of a sentence with get? I'm getting a coffee. Can we cut that object, coffee, out And is it still a good sentence in English? I get. I am getting. It sounds a bit weird. And that's because get is a transitive verb that requires another thing to fulfill and be complete. Just like want. I am wanting. What are you wanting? You have to finish that sentence. You haven't finished. That's because that's transitive as well. I find. What do you find? You haven't finished your sentence. So these verbs need both the one doing it and the thing they're doing it to. And that is a transitive verb. Intransitive verbs don't generally require that second part. Sleep. I sleep. I'm sleeping. Great. Nothing to add there. Nothing needed. I'm standing. Sure. Great. I'm crying. That's a shame, but it was a good sentence. That's something to cheer you up, knowing that. And a lot of these intransitive verbs actually don't let you have an object. You can't really cry something. Maybe floods of tears, but that's a little bit of a sort of metaphor more than a real thing. I suppose in a way you could say that transitive verbs really like company, but intransitive verbs sort of like going it alone and doing their own thing. Nothing wrong with either. You verbs do whatever you want to do. Now, a little tool which might help when we're trying to determine transitivity of a verb, because every verb has some kind of category of transitivity around it. We can ask these questions as a general rule of thumb. Does the verb need an object? If the answer is no, then you've probably got an intransitive verb. If the answer is yes, then you've probably got a transitive verb. So let's try this out with a few examples in English. Do these verbs need an object? Buy, arrive, talk, see, sit, put, read. Feel free to pause the video and try and work these out if you think they are transitive, needing an object, or intransitive, not needing an object. So hopefully that was fairly straightforward. You tried some short sentences to see if you could add an object or take one away to see if it made sense. So let's have a look at these. I am buying. That feels like it's lacking something to me. I am arriving. That sounds fine. I am talking. That sounds fine as well. I am seeing. That feels like it's missing an object. I am sitting. Sounds great to me, especially if you've had a long day. I am putting. Yeah, that definitely needs more. And I am reading. Yeah, I am reading sounds right as well. Now let's try it with an object. I am buying something. Much better. I am arriving something. That doesn't sound right. I am talking something. That doesn't sound right. I am seeing something. Sounds good. I am sitting something. That doesn't sound right. I am putting something somewhere. Now this verb, put, actually needs both an object and a location. If I were to say I am putting, that sounds like it's missing something. If I say I am putting something, that sounds peculiar as well. I am putting something somewhere. That sounds fully formed. And this is what we'd call ditransitive. You don't need to worry too much about this, but there are some verbs that actually require even more than a simple transitive. The last example, I am reading, sounds great, but also I am reading something. Both sound great. And this is an ambitransitive verb. It can have an object, but it doesn't need one. Generally, verbs are either transitive or intransitive, but in these situations, there are some of these exceptions that make up smaller categories. But those don't matter in particular to what we're doing today. I just thought it was good to bring those up. So hopefully you determined that buy is transitive, arrive is intransitive, talk is intransitive, see is transitive, sit is intransitive, put is ditransitive, although you might not have known that term, but now you do, and read is ambitransitive. But for the purposes of what we're doing here, being able to distinguish transitive and intransitive verbs is going to be the most important. So with all of these ideas in mind, swimming around in our heads, let's have a look at some examples that hopefully will make it really clear why these things matter. If we're to look at straightforward English sentences like we did earlier, a penguin swims, a penguin catches a fish sees a penguin. We can see that in every situation, a penguin never changes. I've made the subjects and the objects green and the verbs yellow, and we can see that whether you're a subject or an object, whether you're doing it or receiving it, you're not going to change. And that indicates that there's no case on most nouns other than pronouns in English. We don't have case at all. We rely entirely on sentence structure. And now if we split this up into the types of verbs, we have a penguin swims, that's intransitive. You don't really swim something. And then with our transitive verbs, catch and see, we see that still a penguin is a penguin, however you slice it. So if we look at a group of sentences with pronouns in English, we get a different arrangement here. He swims, he catches her, and she sees him. In these examples, we can see that the pronoun actually changes to indicate whether it's doing something or it's receiving an action. We don't do this with normal nouns, it's just the pronouns in English, although we used to do this hundreds of years ago in English. And a lot of languages around the world do this to all of their nouns, especially in First Nations languages in Australia. So if we can imagine that this process of going he, she, him, her, etc., if we can apply that to all nouns, then we've got a case system. But in English, the only clue to a case system, the only examples we have are from our pronouns. So we can see that when it's the subject or the person doing it, he. When it's the object, this becomes him, and similarly she and her. We call this kind of system nominative accusative because one of the nouns will be in the nominative, which is the one doing it, and then accusative is the one receiving it. It's not exactly the same as subject and object because there are things called passive verbs, etc. But we won't worry too much about that right now. That's a bit more advanced. But basically, we can see that nouns can be categorized in two different cases, a subject case and an object case, in these examples at least. And the important thing here as well is that the pronoun he doesn't change if the verb is transitive or intransitive. And the object, her, him, etc., they don't change if it is a transitive verb as well. He catches him or she catches her. We know that if it's the object there, her is always going to be the case, as is him, but if they're the subject, he and she, etc. So we have nominative for the one doing it, and accusative for the one who's receiving that activity somehow. And that's generally the case for a lot of sentence structures, but in passive examples, which we won't go into today, and a few other more complex things like that, It's not as straightforward, but for the time being, there's no need to really worry too much about those. Generally, nominative, accusative, you're looking at the one doing it and the one receiving it. If we look at a third option, we'll actually see that there's another system which will tie up all of the things we've already looked at. If we look at these examples, which are in Nganatara, a language of Western Australia, we have Marlu Yankula, a kangaroo goes, Marlulu Ngalkula Yelenjinya. And the last example, Kunkalu Nyakula Marlunya. We can see that the word that's italicized, marlu, is in each of these examples, but it has something different about it each time. The first time, this marlu is on its own, nothing added to marlu. In the second example, marlulu, there's a lu added at the end. And in the last example, marlunya, there's a nya added. We can also see that in the second two examples, that lu is still there. In the first of these two, a kangaroo eats grass, marlulu, it's the kangaroo doing it. But in the third example, kunka, which means a girl or a woman, kunkalu. So they're doing something to something else, grass or the kangaroo. But in the first example, marlu, there's no lu, because they're not doing it to anyone or anything. So what's going on here? There's another piece to the puzzle. If we look at the second example and we see the word which means grass, yirlinti, we see that this has nya at the end of it. Likewise, the third example, nya is attached to marlu. So here, if we piece this all together with everything we've looked at, we can see that there are actually three different setups here. If you are doing something, but there's no recipient, there's no object of that verb, you're marked one way. But if you're doing something and there is someone else who is the object of that, you will be marked a certain way that's different, and they will be marked a certain way. So we've actually got three ways of marking a noun here that indicates exactly who is doing something, if it's to someone else, and who is having that thing done to them. So we have a subject for intransitive verbs, a subject for transitive verbs, and an object. Naturally, the object is only for transitive verbs because intransitive verbs can't take an object. And this we would call an ergative system. So if we break up all of these three different contexts, we see there are three different case systems. If nouns don't change regardless of what they're doing, we have no case. If nouns act one way when they're doing something, another way when they're the recipient of the action, that's nominative accusative. And if nouns act one way when they're doing something to no one, intransitive, and another way when they're doing something to something, and then possibly another way again to when they are the recipient, then we have an ergative system. This is something which is very, very confusing at first. But once we start to think, does the verb have an object? And does the noun change depending on what it's doing? We start to get an idea of what ergative actually means. If we wanted a different visualization of these cases, we could think about them as hats in a way. So in a language like English, which doesn't have cases on regular nouns, there are no hats. If you have a nominative accusative system, like we do in our pronouns in English or languages like Latin, Russian will have, you'll wear a different hat when you're doing something and another hat when something is being done to you. In a lot of languages, the nominative is the most basic form of the noun, so nothing is really attached to it. Whereas the object case, which is the accusative case, will have some kind of suffix, prefix, or something that changes it. With an ergative system, nouns wear one hat if they are doing something with no object, but they will wear another hat if they're doing something with an object. There will also be a hat which is worn by the nouns that are having something done to them. In some languages, there will be a hat for these last two situations, but the basic form without any suffixes will just be on the subject when it's doing something with no object. So you'll actually only really have two suffixes, one for nouns which are doing something to an object and objects. But in some languages, you'll actually just get two suffixes which are applied where the subject of a transitive sentence is marked one way, and both the subject of an intransitive sentence and objects of transitive sentences have the same suffix. In a lot of the languages of Western Australia that I'm mainly familiar with, we have this three-part system where there is no suffix on the subject of an intransitive sentence, but there is a specific suffix which sits on the subject of transitive sentences and also another hat or suffix which sits on the object. Any individual language will have its own way of doing this, but these are some of the most common situations. It's important to go back to the idea of these core cases that we mentioned at the beginning of this segment, because these cases that indicate subject and object in various ways are the core cases that indicate the main players in a sentence. It's important not to confuse nouns which are marked with something like a location, like in a tree, at a tree, away from a tree. These are not cases which indicate a subject or an object at all. And for example, in the sentence, I saw a bird in a tree. In a tree is something you could cut out, because it just indicates the location. It's not actually a subject or an object at all. I am the subject there, and the bird is the object. The tree is just additional information. So in these languages, especially the ones I'm familiar with in Western Australia, we'll have a subject and possibly an object, and there will be other nouns which are marked with suffixes that indicate in, at, away from, etc. But those are not core cases, so they're not relevant to ergativity or nominatives or accusatives at all. They're more like additional cases, we might say peripheral cases. In other words, they're not essential to a sentence. If you have someone doing something to someone else or something else, you basically are required to have these two nouns there. But the exact location isn't necessary to create a fully formed sentence. So we'll have another little map here, another rule of thumb, which is a little bit more complicated, but it will start to get us thinking about how we can determine the case system of a language. So if we look at a bunch of nouns and we look at them both in that subject of the one doing it and the object of the one receiving that action, do nouns stay the same regardless of when they are subject or object? If the answer is yes, like in English we have a penguin swims, a penguin sees a fish sees a penguin never changes. We can say there's no case involved there. If the answer is no to that question, we can see that the nouns are changing depending on where they fit in the story. We can ask the next question. Do nouns behave one way when they're a subject and another way when they're an object? If the answer is yes, and there's a consistency there, we can say we have a nominative accusative. So nouns look one way when they're doing something, no matter what it is, and another way when they're receiving that verb, that action. If the answer to this is no, we have to ask the question, do nouns behave one way when it's an intransitive subject, another way when it's a transitive subject? Then we most likely have something that's much more like an ergative case system. Now, all of these different ideas and different systems might seem perhaps unnecessary, but the nature of language is that languages have characteristics which they simply have. And it's never really up to us to say, why is it so complicated? It shouldn't be that way. The fact of the matter is, languages have really varied and rich varieties of different formulas and arrangements and phenomena. And the ergative case systems of First Nations languages in Australia and in other parts of the world is just one of the rich and beautiful things of many, many languages. And it's just a simple fact that they employ these systems. You can get a lot deeper into case, and you can find that there's a lot more to it than this. But this is the core, is that nouns are a thing in language. Case is a thing which is attached to a noun. It doesn't mean that anything in the real world changes. It's purely within the sentence, within language, that we have these cases, these little additional hats that they're wearing. That might be one way to see it. Is the noun wearing a different hat depending on the transitive nature of the verb or where they fit in the arrangement? So in summary, case is all about how nouns are marked, telling us what role they're playing in the sentence. Nominative accusative systems mark subjects one way and objects another way, whereas ergative systems make subjects of intransitive verbs look one way and subjects of transitive verbs look another way. Hopefully this has not made everything even more confusing, and I welcome anyone to leave a comment and get in contact with me, and I'll do my best to clarify anything that makes absolutely no sense. But I really thank anyone who's taken the time to watch this, and I hope in some way it's made some of these ideas much clearer, and hopefully you have grasped it and you look back and think, how did I ever not get this? This is actually really straightforward. One of the best things for anyone who has watched this and would like to really delve into it and understand is to look at some good examples online. And I will find some resources online that will have some good examples, maybe to test yourself and to start thinking about the place in the sentence of nouns and what different suffixes, prefixes, hats they'll be wearing at any given time. Thank you so much for your attention, and good luck and best wishes with all of your delving into the various aspects of aspect and case.